Welcome to Silent History, where the past speaks in whispers. Before we begin, allow yourself to slow down. There is nothing you need to do right now, and nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to prepare for. If you are lying down, let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Gently adjust your pillow, and let your shoulders soften. Let your hands rest wherever they feel most comfortable. You have stepped away from the noise of the modern world, the constant movement, and the bright lights, the endless urgency. Here there is only calm. For the next 3 hours we will drift together down the river of time and traveling far from the present and into the quiet heart of ancient Egypt. A land shaped by gold light and long shadows. A land of sand that remembers every footstep and stone that has learned patience. A land where history does not shout, it waits. There will be no sudden sounds here, no sharp moments, and only slow stories told at the pace of breath. Only images that rise gently like mist over water and fade just as softly. As we move through pyramids and temples, and through silent valleys and sleeping cities, you do not need to stay awake. You do not need to listen closely. You do not need to follow every word, and simply let the voice carry you. Let the rhythm guide your breathing. Let your thoughts drift like sand in a warm evening wind. If sleep comes quickly, allow it, and if it comes slowly, that is fine too. Tonight history will keep watch, so you can rest. Desert is quiet now, not the empty kind of quiet that feels unfinished, but a deep and ancient silence, and the kind that has learned patience over thousands of slow, moving years, the kind that settles gently over sand and stone and does not ask to be disturbed. And the sun rests low in the sky, spreading warm light across the Giza Plateau, and the air seems to pause, as if holding a long, careful breath. And before there were cities filled with sound, before the world learned to hurry, this land already understood stillness. The sand lies softly against the earth, and shaped by wind so gradual it feels almost invisible. And above it all, the pyramids rise, calm and unmoving, their presence steady and unannounced. And the Great Pyramid does not shout for attention. It does not demand to be noticed. It stands quietly, its massive form softened by distance and time, and appearing less like a monument and more like a natural extension of the land itself, as though the earth gently lifted stone upward and then decided to rest, and its surface is warm beneath the sun, each block carrying the faint texture of age, edges smoothed by centuries of wind and sand. The pyramid does not glow brightly, and instead, it absorbs the light, holding it in muted shades of gold and pale limestone, reflecting only what it needs to. There are no voices here now, no movement, and no signs of effort. Only the whisper of wind as it drifts across the desert, brushing lightly against stone, slipping into invisible spaces, and continuing onward without urgency. To imagine how this structure came into being, we must step away from modern noise and modern speed, and the construction of the Great Pyramid was not loud. It was not chaotic, it did not unfold in a rush of sound and motion. It emerged slowly, patiently, and through repetition and rhythm beneath the vast Egyptian sun. Picture the earliest mornings, when the sky is still soft with pale color, and the heat has not yet fully settled. The air is cool, almost gentle, and carries the scent of dry earth and stone dust. The desert feels calm, open, and endlessly wide, and workers arrive quietly, their footsteps pressing lightly into packed sand. There is no urgency in their movement, no need for raised voices. Each motion is familiar, and learned through countless days that blend seamlessly into one another. Stone blocks wait nearby, resting in quiet readiness. They are not obstacles. They are not burdens. and they are simply stone, patient and unmoving, content to remain where they are until guided elsewhere. Hands touch the limestone, warm even in the early hours, and its surface slightly rough, grounding. Ropes are looped carefully, tension applied gradually, evenly, without sudden force, and wooden sleds begin to slide across sand dampened just enough to allow smooth movement, gliding forward with a steady calm. There is a rhythm here, and one that does not need instruction. Pull, pause, breathe. Step forward, then rest. Pull again. The rhythm settles into the body, becoming as natural as breath, and this work does not rush because it does not need to. Time stretches wide in this place, and there is room within it for patience. Days are not measured by completion, but by continuation. As the sun rises higher, warmth spreads slowly across the land, shadows shorten. The desert hums softly, not with sound, but with heat and light pressing gently against everything it touches. The pyramid grows, not suddenly, but almost imperceptibly. A single layer today, another tomorrow, and stone placed upon stone with careful attention, each block aligned with quiet precision. No one steps back to admire the entire shape. Most see only their section, and their task, their small contribution. And yet, the pyramid takes form regardless, its geometry unfolding naturally, guided by knowledge that does not require explanation. And the structure feels inevitable, as though it already exists, and is simply being revealed. As days turn into months, and months dissolve into years, and the land adjusts to the presence of the growing pyramid. Wind learns how to move around it. Sunlight learns where its shadows will fall, and the stone itself begins to remember its place. Midday arrives with heavier warmth. Movement slows naturally, not from exhaustion, but from understanding, and the body responds to the desert with respect, conserving energy, choosing deliberate motion over speed. There is still no shouting, no sharp sounds, and instructions are unnecessary. Every movement has become memory, every action shaped by repetition rather than command. Water is sipped slowly, and cloth shields skin from the sun. The pyramid waits, unaffected by pauses, content to rise at its own measured pace. In the afternoon, the light softens again, and spreading warmth across stone surfaces that glow faintly, reflecting muted gold and cream tones. The air carries a sense of steady progress, and even as work continues without drama, blocks are guided into place with care. Alignment is checked by eye, by touch, and by a quiet understanding passed down through practice rather than words. Each stone settles, fitting into the larger form as though it has always belonged there. And the pyramid is not built in a single moment of history. It is built across countless ordinary days, each one beginning with light and ending with shadow, and days filled with slow movement and quiet focus. Days where the only sounds are breath, sand shifting softly beneath feet, and the faint slide of stone across earth. And as the structure rises higher, movement becomes more deliberate. The climb slows, not from difficulty, but from awareness. Each step upward feels careful, balanced, calm, and from above, the desert stretches endlessly, a vast sea of sand fading into the horizon, its surface rippling gently beneath the sun. From below, the pyramid grows steadily, and its presence grounding, its edges sharp yet serene. Those who work here do not think of eternity. They think of the present moment, of placing this stone correctly, and of finishing this layer before the light fades. And yet, eternity is forming beneath their hands. At sunset, the site grows quiet once more. Tools are set down gently, and, as though not to disturb the air, footsteps retreat slowly across cooling sand. The pyramid remains, absorbing the last warmth of the day, and the sky deepens into soft shades of amber, rose, and violet. Shadows stretch long again, wrapping the base of the structure in cool relief. The pyramid stands unfinished but untroubled. It has learned patience from the desert that holds it. Night arrives without announcement. Stars appear gradually and scattered across the dark sky like distant points of calm light. The air cools, the desert exhales, the pyramid rests. This pattern repeats itself endlessly. Morning light and slow movement, measured progress, evening stillness, no dramatic moments, no sudden transformations, only accumulation. Stone remembers stone, layer remembers layer, and as years pass, the pyramid nears completion. Its broad base has already claimed its place. Now the structure narrows gently toward the sky, becoming more precise and more refined, as though learning how to disappear into the heavens above. The final stones are lighter in size but heavier in meaning. Their placement feels quiet, careful, and almost delicate. Each one settles with a sense of completion that does not need acknowledgement. There is no celebration, no moment of noise, and only a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the land itself has noticed something finished. The Great Pyramid stands whole. It does not move. It does not speak, and it simply exists, holding silence within its vast and perfect geometry. Inside, narrow passages wind through stone, cool and dark, absorbing sound, swallowing echoes. And the interior is not designed for noise. It is shaped for stillness. Walls feel smooth beneath fingertips, worn gently by time rather than use. The air is heavy and calm, and unmoving, resting quietly in darkness. This is not a place of motion. It is a place of rest. Above ground, the desert continues its slow work, and wind brushes sand against stone, polishing edges, softening surfaces, erasing sharpness over centuries. The pyramid does not resist. It allows time to pass over it, and moment by moment, grain by grain, the Great Pyramid remains not as a monument of noise or conquest, but as a monument of patience, built through repetition, restraint, and trust in time. As you imagine it now, standing beneath the stars, silent and unmoving, let the rhythm of its creation settle gently into your thoughts. Slow, steady, and endless. Let the desert quiet surround you. Let the warmth of stone fade into cool night air. Let the pyramid stand unchanged as your thoughts begin to drift. And the silence here is not empty. It is full of time, full of stillness. And as the wind continues its gentle passage across sand and stone, the Great Pyramid remains, and watching quietly, resting beneath the eternal sky. The night air over Giza is cool, and the sand seems to settle into a deeper stillness, as though every grain is choosing the most comfortable place to rest. Above, and the stars linger in slow arrangements, and the sky feels wide enough to hold every quiet thought you have ever had. And there, and not far from the great stone mountain of the pyramid, a different shape waits in the darkness, lower to the ground, calmer in its posture, and yet strangely alive in the way it watches. The Sphinx lies stretched across the pow, half lion, half human, carved from the living limestone, and, as if the earth itself decided to form a guardian and then fell asleep beside it. In the soft light of early dawn, the Sphinx does not rise. It does not move, and it does not shift its gaze. It simply remains, facing the eastern horizon, as it has for countless mornings, greeting the sun with an expression that never changes, and an expression that does not demand meaning, yet invites it. Imagine the first pale glow of morning spreading across the desert, and turning the sand from deep gray into faint gold. The air is still cool, and the scent of dry stone and distant river water hangs lightly, imperceptibly, and a breeze passes over the plateau, gentle enough to feel like a sigh. The Sphinx receives the breeze without reaction. It has received so many breezes and so many seasons of air, so many changes in temperature, that each one is simply another soft layer of time drifting across its face. Its body is long and grounded, and pressed close to the earth, as though it is listening to the slow heartbeat of the land. Its paws extend forward, calm and patient, set in a posture of unending rest. And its face, worn by centuries, is turned toward the rising sun, as if it is forever waiting for a familiar light. The Sphinx is often called a mystery, but it does not feel mysterious in a loud or dramatic way. Its mystery is quiet, like a closed door in an empty house, like a forgotten room that remains untouched, and not because it is hidden, but because it is simply still. It is stone, and yet it feels like a presence. When you stand near it in your mind, and you begin to notice the way it holds silence, how the air around it seems to soften. Even the wind changes when it meets the Sphinx, breaking into smaller currents and sliding along the carved contours, slipping gently around the broad shoulders and the steady chest. Over the long ages, the Sphinx has become a companion to the desert, and the sand has touched it in tender, persistent ways, gathering at its sides, creeping toward its paws, then retreating again, as though the desert is practicing a slow and endless embrace. Sometimes the sand rises higher, covering more of the body, hiding the long lion form beneath a blanket of pale grains. Sometimes the sand pulls away, and revealing stone once more, as if the Sphinx is being rediscovered again and again, in the same quiet cycle. Through all of it, the Sphinx does not complain, and it does not resist. It simply remains. To think of the Sphinx is to think of time moving without noise. It is to imagine centuries flowing past like wind over dunes, and each year a soft ripple, each generation a faint footprint soon smoothed away. When the Sphinx was new, its surface would have been sharper, its edges more defined, and its face more clearly shaped. The limestone would have held the sun differently, catching light along clean lines and brightening under noon heat and cooling under night skies. But even then, it would have been quiet. The act of carving it was not an explosion of sound, and it was patient work, steady and measured, like water shaping stone. Tools pressed and scraped. Stone dust drifted. The shape emerged gradually, and as though the Sphinx had always been there, and was simply being freed from the rock. Day after day, the desert sun rose and fell. Shadows stretched and returned, and the air filled with heat and then softened again. And the Sphinx took form in the slow rhythm of repetition. When the carving was finished, and it did not begin a new life of movement, it began a life of stillness. It became a watcher. Not a watcher with restless eyes, not a watcher searching for something, and a watcher in the simplest sense, the way a mountain watches the valley, the way the horizon watches the sea. It watches by being present. From its place on the plateau, and it has watched the sun rise thousands upon thousands of times. Each sunrise is slightly different, a subtle shift in color, a new arrangement of clouds, and a different softness in the air. Yet the Sphinx meets each one with the same calm face, the same unchanging gaze. In the early morning, when the light is low and gentle, and the Sphinx appears warm, its limestone turning soft gold, its shadows deep but smooth. The carved face catches the first light along the brow and cheek, and while the rest of the body lies in quiet shade. As the sun climbs, the heat becomes heavier, settling over the plateau like a slow blanket. The stone warms, and the sand brightens. The air shimmers slightly in the distance. The Sphinx remains at midday. The sky is bright and empty, a wide blue stillness above the pale earth, and the Sphinx rests beneath it, receiving the sun without movement, as though its purpose is simply to be there, steady and grounded, holding the shape of patience. and in the afternoon, the light begins to soften again. The shadows lengthen, the desert seems to exhale, and the Sphinx continues its silent watching and accepting the day as it passes. Then comes evening, when the world turns quieter, when the heat releases its grip and the air cools, and when the sky shifts into amber and violet. The Sphinx watches the sun sink toward the horizon, watches the last light fade from the stone. Night arrives gently, and with stars returning like familiar friends. The Sphinx remains, dark against the dark, a presence felt more than seen, as though the plateau itself is shaped around it, and, if you listen closely in your imagination, you might hear the smallest sounds of the desert at night, a distant rustle of sand, a soft movement of air, and these are not sharp sounds. They are more like textures, like the faint sound of cloth moving, like the whisper of a page turning far away. And the Sphinx holds these sounds and lets them pass. It has watched so much, and yet it tells nothing. That is part of its strange comfort, and it does not overwhelm you with stories. It does not demand that you remember details. It simply suggests that time is larger than any one moment, and that stillness can last. Long after the hands that carved it disappeared, the Sphinx continued to face the sunrise. Kingdoms rose and faded, names changed, and languages shifted like dunes. But the sunrise kept coming, and the Sphinx kept watching. It has watched travelers arrive across the desert, and small figures against the wide land, moving slowly, pausing often, carrying water and quiet hopes. It has watched them draw near, stand in the shadow of its face, and look up, as if trying to understand what cannot be fully understood. It has watched priests and workers, scholars and shepherds, soldiers and merchants, and all passing through the same dry air, all leaving behind only footprints soon erased by wind. It has watched storms roll across the plateau, wind lifting sand into the sky, and turning the world pale and blurred. During those storms, the Sphinx becomes a darker shape within a moving veil, and its gaze unchanged even as the air fills with swirling grains. The sand strikes the stone over and over, not violently, but persistently, and like a soft brushing that never ends. Over centuries, this gentle brushing changes the surface, smoothing it, rounding it, and making the face and body feel more like something shaped by time than by tools. Sometimes, after storms, the plateau is quiet again, the air clear, the stars bright, and the Sphinx remains, patient after the passing of weather, patient after the passing of years. At other times, the desert is so still that the silence feels thick and like a physical presence. In those moments, the Sphinx seems to deepen the calm, as if its very shape encourages the world to slow down. And it is easy to imagine that the Sphinx remembers everything it has seen, every sunrise, every passerby, every shifting pattern of sand. And perhaps, and in a way that stone remembers, it does. Not as a mind remembers, not as a voice remembers, but as the surface of limestone holds the mark of wind, and as the edges of carving soften under time, as the very posture of the Sphinx becomes more restful with each century. Its body lies close to the earth, and as though it is part of the plateau itself. Its chest is broad and steady. Its paws extend forward like an invitation to pause, to sit down beside it, and to rest your thoughts near the place where time moves slowly. And its face, though worn, still holds a certain calm. The mouth is closed. The eyes, shaped long ago, and remain fixed on the horizon. The expression suggests no urgency, no fear, no excitement, only a quiet awareness in the bright day, and people often speak of what is missing from the Sphinx, of what has been worn away, of what has changed. But in the gentle tone of sleep, and it can be comforting to think of what remains. What remains is the posture. What remains is the gaze. What remains is the steady presence, day after day, night after night, and year after year. The Sphinx is a lesson in endurance without effort. It shows how something can last not by struggling, but by simply being. And imagine the plateau in different seasons. In cooler months, the air might feel crisper in the morning, and the stone might hold a slight chill before the sun warms it. And in hotter months, the heat arrives early, and the sand becomes bright, almost white, reflecting the sunlight upward. Through every shift, the Sphinx remains, and the sun still rises in the east. The shadows still move. The wind still drifts across the plateau. And the Sphinx continues its slow watching. And if you could sit near it for a long time, your own thoughts might begin to slow. The mind, which often jumps from one idea to another, might start to mirror the desert, and settling into long stretches of quiet. You might notice the smallest details, the way sand gathers in shallow curves near the paws, and the way tiny cracks in stone catch shadow, the way the light changes the color of limestone from pale cream to warm gold. And you might notice how the Sphinx seems to belong to the horizon, how its gaze makes the horizon feel closer, more personal, and as though it is sharing the simple act of looking out, looking forward, waiting. The Sphinx has watched the Nile change its moods in the distance, and watched the green line of life along the river remain while the desert stays dry and open. It has watched distant lights appear in modern nights, and watched the world grow brighter in places beyond the plateau, while the stars still shine above it. Yet none of these changes have changed the Sphinx itself, and it does not adapt. It does not evolve. It remains a carved moment of ancient intention, held in place by the patient weight of stone, and perhaps that is why it feels soothing. In a world that moves quickly, a Sphinx offers a different tempo, a slower pace, a gentler rhythm. It says, without words, and that it is possible to simply remain. As you listen, imagine the Sphinx at dawn again, the first light touching its face. The air is quiet. The desert is calm, and the plateau holds its breath. The sun rises slowly, and the Sphinx watches, and always has and will, for as long as stone can hold its shape beneath the sky. And let your own thoughts become like the sand, settling softly. Let the rhythm of sunrise and shadow drift through your mind, and let the watcher in the sand remain steady beside you, holding silence in its long, patient gaze. In the deepest part of night, when the plateau is lit only by moonlight, and the Sphinx becomes a softer silhouette, a shape drawn in silver and shadow, the moon does not strike it sharply. It washes over it, gentle and cool, and turning the stone into a quiet mirror of the sky. The sand around it looks smooth, like calm water, and the world feels hushed, as if even distance has fallen asleep. And in that moonlit calm, the Sphinx seems even more ancient, not because it is older, but because night removes distraction. Without the bright clarity of day, and you notice only essential forms: the long body resting, the lifted head, the steady line of the horizon. Everything else fades into darkness, and the Sphinx feels like the center of a slow, silent circle. The Sphinx has always been skilled at receiving. It receives light, it receives shade, and it receives wind and warmth and coolness. And it receives sand again and again in small, patient waves. And there were long centuries when the Sphinx was more buried than visible, when only the head and part of the shoulders rose above the sand, like an island in a pale sea. And in those times, the body slept beneath dunes, hidden not by walls, but by the gentle accumulation of grains. The Sphinx became quieter still, and not because it could not be seen, but because it did not need to be. In that half-buried state, the Sphinx would have watched the sun rise from lower down, and as though the horizon itself had moved. The light would have touched its face while its paws remained covered, resting in cool darkness under sand, and the wind would have drawn small, delicate patterns around its cheeks, making tiny ridges that changed each day, like slow handwriting written by air. Then, in other times, and people returned to clear the sand away, not in a rush, but patiently, with care, revealing the long body again, and uncovering paws and chest, and the carved lines that had been resting beneath the dunes. The act of uncovering was like waking something that never truly slept, and like brushing dust from an old stone floor until the pattern returns. Even this uncovering does not feel like noise when imagined gently. It is the sound of soft sweeping, and of sand falling away in small streams, of sunlight returning to surfaces that have been in shadow. It is the calm sensation of something becoming visible, and not as a surprise, but as a quiet reminder. The Sphinx has been known in different names and different languages, yet it does not seem to care what it is called, and names pass like clouds. The stone remains. It is simply a watcher, and it watches with the same calm patience regardless of what humans say about it, and if you sit with that thought, it can feel soothing. So many things in life depend on words, on explanations, on quick answers. Here, in the presence of the Sphinx, and words feel unnecessary. The stone does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not insist. It simply holds its shape under the sky. In the warm light of late afternoon, and when the sun begins to lower again, the Sphinx's shadow stretches across the sand, long and soft-edged. The shadow is like a second Sphinx made of shade, and a quiet companion lying beside the original. As the sun continues its slow descent, the shadow grows, then shifts, then fades into evening. And this daily movement of shadow is one of the few visible motions connected to the Sphinx. The Sphinx does not move, but the world around it does, and the shadow tells you that time is passing. It is a gentle clock measured in light, not numbers. Sometimes the sky fills with thin clouds, and then the light becomes even softer, diffused, almost creamy. On those days, the Sphinx looks less defined, more like a dream shape, as though it might dissolve into the air, and yet it does not. It remains grounded and real, present in every kind of weather. There is a particular quietness to limestone. It holds warmth but releases it slowly, and it feels solid, but it also feels calm, as though it has never been startled. When you imagine resting your palm against the Sphinx, and you can imagine the heat of the day stored inside it, a gentle warmth that lingers into evening. Then, later at night, that warmth fades. The stone cools, and the air becomes crisp. The desert takes on a cooler scent, and the stars feel brighter. In the coolness, the Sphinx feels even more still, and as if it has settled deeper into its own patience. If you imagine your own breathing matching this rhythm, you might breathe a little slower, a little deeper, and inhale as the night grows calm. Exhale as the plateau rests. Each breath comes long and unhurried, like wind moving over dunes. And beneath the sky, and the plateau remains a place of quiet waiting. The sand gathers. The sand falls away. The day warms. The night cools. The Sphinx holds its gaze on the horizon, and steady and unchanging, like a calm thought you can return to whenever your mind feels busy. Now, as this chapter continues, and allow the watcher in the sand to become a gentle anchor in your imagination. Let its stillness spread into your shoulders, into your hands, into the muscles of your face, and let the silence it holds become a soft blanket over your thoughts. You do not need to solve its mystery. You do not need to imagine hidden messages, and you only need to feel the slow, steady presence of something that has waited so long that waiting has become its natural state. And as the next sunrise approaches in your mind, with the first pale light touching the eastern horizon, the Sphinx remains, calm and quiet, watching the world awaken, and while you drift slowly and comfortably toward rest. The desert loosens its grip as you move away from the plateau, and the air begins to change in the gentlest way, as if the land itself is learning a softer language. And, beyond the warm stone and whispering sand, there is a line of green that seems almost impossible in so much dryness, and a quiet ribbon of life that has never needed to raise its voice to be noticed. This is the Nile. It does not roar. It does not rush with wild impatience. And it moves with the calm confidence of something that has always known where it is going, and has never been afraid of how long it will take. And the river stretches through Egypt like a slow, living thought, reflective and steady, holding the sky on its surface, and carrying light and shadow as though they are simple offerings. In the early morning, before the sun grows heavy, the Nile feels like a sheet of softened glass, and mist hovers low, pale and delicate, drifting above the water in thin layer of dissolve as soon as the light touches them. Along the banks, reeds sway lightly, and brushing against one another with a sound so small it feels more like a texture than a noise. The river is awake, but it is never hurried, and you can imagine standing at the edge of it, feeling cool air rise from the surface, a faint sweetness mixed with earth, mud, and green growth, and the water moves past your gaze with slow, unbroken continuity. And if you follow it with your eyes, and you begin to feel how time becomes gentle near a river that has been flowing for so long. The Nile has watched Egypt without judgment. It has watched it change, and again, as quietly as the water changes shape around a stone. It has watched fields expand and shrink, watched villages become towns, watched towns become cities, and watched lights appear where once there were only stars and oil lamps and moonlit paths. Yet the river remains the same kind of presence, steady and patient, and when the day brightens, the sun spreads gold across the surface, and the Nile becomes a moving mirror. Light breaks into soft ripples, and shimmering in slow patterns that never repeat, and the water seems to breathe, widening and narrowing gently around bends, and slipping past banks lined with palms and cultivated fields. In this calm movement, there is a rhythm that feels ancient, and long before any stone monument rose from the desert, the Nile was already here, carrying silt and seeds, shaping the land with every season, and offering water where the sand would otherwise keep everything quiet and still. The river did not need to conquer the desert. It simply arrived and stayed, and the land learned to gather around it. The Nile does not speak in words, but it communicates through consistency. It tells the same story every day: flow, reflect, and nourish, continue. It does not demand attention. It invites it gently, like the way a quiet room invites you to sit down and rest. Along the banks, and you can picture the soft movement of life that depends on the water. A breeze passes over leaves, and their shadows drift across the surface. Birds glide low, and their reflections stretching and then breaking as they pass. The water receives everything without resistance, allowing each reflection to appear, to shimmer, to vanish. And this is how the Nile watches history. It watches by receiving. It has received boats made from reeds and wood, long and narrow, sliding across the water with slow strokes. And it has received barges carrying stone, moving patiently downstream, their weight held by water that does not complain. It has received fishermen casting nets in quiet arcs, and farmers leaning close to the shore to draw water with simple tools, lifting it in steady, practiced motions. These motions are not dramatic, and they are the gentle routines of living beside a river that has always been there. Imagine an ancient morning, when the light is soft and the air is still cool, and a small boat rests near the bank, tethered loosely, rocking almost imperceptibly. Someone steps in carefully, and the boat accepts the weight with a slow dip, then settles, and a pull presses into the riverbed, and the boat slides forward, quiet as a thought. The banks are lined with green, and behind them, the desert begins again, pale and open, and watching from a distance. Between the two, the Nile holds the boundary, neither fully desert nor fully forest, but a calm passage, a living corridor. As the sun climbs, and the river continues its steady movement, and the surface grows brighter, the air warms. The scent of wet earth rises more strongly, and in the reeds along the shore release a faint, clean fragrance, like freshly cut grass softened by water. In the heat of midday, and the Nile becomes even quieter in a strange way, as if the brightness mutes everything. The water still moves, but the movement looks slower under the glare, and the ripples seem to flatten into long, gentle lines. On the far bank, palm trees stand with their fronds lifted like quiet hands, and a field of crops lies close to the water, green and dense, and you can almost feel the coolness that lingers where water has touched soil. In the distance, and beyond the green, the desert shimmers, a pale horizon that seems to drift. The Nile sits between these worlds, calm and unbothered, and if you follow the river in your imagination, you begin to sense its long memory, not as a collection of events, but as an accumulation of seasons. Flood and retreat, and growth and harvest. Heat and coolness, each cycle repeating with gentle certainty. For a long time, the Nile's flooding was a kind of quiet miracle, and arriving like a slow breath, rising without alarm, spreading water across the low land, leaving behind rich silt that darkened the soil and made it fertile. And the flood did not feel like disaster in this place. It felt like renewal, a soft, muddy blessing that turned dry earth into something that could hold green life. And when the water receded, it left the land changed, heavier with nutrients, ready for planting, ready for the simple routines that would follow. And the river did not announce this gift. It simply did what it had always done. And people learned to listen, not with ears, but with attention. They watched the water level, and they noticed the timing. They measured the seasons by the river's behavior, and in doing so, they lived in rhythm with something larger than themselves. And this rhythm is still here, even when modern structures guide the water differently. The river remains a teacher of slowness. It asks the mind to stretch and to think in long intervals, to accept that the most important changes often arrive quietly. At sunset, the Nile becomes a path of light. The sun lowers, and its reflection stretches across the surface in a long, glowing band as the river is carrying the day away. The sky turns amber, then rose, then a softer violet, and in the water reflects it all, rippling the colors into gentle motion. The air cools, the banks grow quieter. Birds settle. The reeds stop swaying as much, and the river continues, steady and unbroken, moving under the softening sky. Night brings a different kind of calm. The Nile darkens, becoming a deeper mirror, and stars appear above, and some of them scatter across the surface in broken lines of light, shimmering each time the water shifts. If the moon is present, and it lays a silver path across the river, and the water seems to hold that light tenderly, carrying it forward, as if transporting moonlight from one bend to the next. And in this night quiet, you can imagine how many nights the Nile has seen. Thousands upon thousands. and nights when the only light came from the sky and from small fires along the banks. Nights when people sat near the water and spoke softly, or sat in silence and listened to the faint movement of reeds and the distant call of birds. The river watched all of this without interruption, and it watched the rise of temples and the slow weathering of stone. It watched statues stand tall and then disappear beneath sand or time, and it watched boats carry offerings and supplies. It watched travelers arrive from distant places, stepping onto the banks with tired feet, grateful for water, for shade, and for the calm promise of the river. It watched and kept flowing. The Nile's watching is different from the watching of the Sphinx. The Sphinx watches by staying still, and the Nile watches by continuing. Both are forms of patience. Both are ways of holding time without being disturbed by it. Where the river bends, and you can imagine eddies forming, small circles of water that turn gently in place, like quiet thoughts looping softly. Leaves float past, and a reed dips into the current and rises again. The water does not cling, it releases everything, letting it move onward. And as the river releases, it also carries. And it carries silt and tiny fragments of earth, moving them slowly downstream, depositing them where they are needed. It carries seeds that will settle along the banks, and it carries coolness into the air. It carries reflections of palm trees and clouds, carrying a moving image of the world as it passes. In the morning again, and the same rhythm returns. Light touches the surface. Mist lifts. Reeds slide quietly. The river continues, never hurried, never stalled, always present. And if you imagine standing on a simple bank, your feet close to the damp soil, you might feel how the Nile changes the temperature of the air. Even in heat, and there is a softness near water, a gentle cooling. The breeze feels more forgiving. The air feels more breathable. This is why the river feels like comfort, and it is not only water. It is relief. For thousands of years, people have lived close to this relief, building their homes where the river's influence reaches, and planting where the soil stays dark, walking paths that follow the water's curve like a familiar line. They have watched the river the way you watch a steady flame, and not because it is exciting, but because it is dependable. And the river has watched them back, not with eyes, but with a constant presence that never leaves. And sometimes the Nile appears almost still, especially when the wind is gentle and the current is slow, and the surface becomes a calm plain, and reflecting the sky so clearly that it feels like another world. In those moments, the boundary between water and air seems to soften, and the river feels like a quiet doorway between two kinds of silence. Even when the current is moving, it moves with such ease that it feels like rest. Along the banks, and the soundscape is soft. Water touching shore, reeds brushing. A distant bird call that fades quickly. Maybe the faint creak of wood from a boat. Nothing sharp, and nothing sudden. Everything gentle and spaced out, allowing long pauses where the mind can relax. If you drift along the river in your imagination, you might pass through stretches where the banks are crowded with green, where the water seems to hug the plants closely, and then through stretches where the land opens again, where sand returns, where the green line thins, where the river feels like a lone traveler moving through vastness. And in all these places, the river keeps its same calm character. It does not become dramatic when the landscape changes. It remains itself, and that steadiness can feel like a lullaby. And you may notice something else. Something subtle. The river's surface holds time differently. When you watch moving water, and you can lose track of minutes. Your thoughts can drift without effort. The repetitive motion of ripples and reflections becomes hypnotic, and like watching clouds move slowly or listening to distant wind. The Nile in this way offers rest not just to the body, but to the mind. If you think of the Great Pyramid, and you think of stone placed carefully, layer by layer, in long patience. If you think of the Sphinx, you think of a carved gaze holding the horizon in quiet watching. And if you think of the Nile, you think of flow, a continuous presence that has shaped every life beside it. The Nile's story is not told in battles or dates, and it is told in mornings and evenings, in planting and harvesting, in the quiet act of drawing water, in the way families return to the same bank, and generation after generation. It is told in the simple fact that water keeps coming, and even when the world changes its methods, and even when modern structures influence the river's path, the essential feeling remains. There is still a ribbon of calm moving through the land, and there is still a surface that reflects the sky. There is still a coolness in the air near the banks. There is still a steady movement that suggests continuation. And imagine sitting near the river at dusk, when the light is low and the air is soft. The sky is turning warmer and then slowly dimmer. The water reflects it all, and you can see the first star appearing above, then another, while the river continues to carry their broken reflections downstream, and your breathing slows to match the pace of the current. Inhale, and the water keeps moving. Exhale, and the ripples stretch gently. The world becomes simpler and reduced to water, light, and air. This is how the Nile has watched history pass by, not by holding on to it, but by letting it move along, and letting it be carried away into the distance, the way the river carries leaves, the way it carries silt, the way it carries light. It holds the present for a moment, and then it releases it. And so, in the quiet of the night, with the river moving softly under stars, you can allow your thoughts to do the same, and you can let them appear and shimmer, and then fade, and then drift away, leaving behind only the calm sensation of steady water. The Nile continues, unbroken, and flowing through the darkness with the same gentle patience it has always had, watching without judgment, nourishing without noise, and reflecting the sky without needing to keep it, and carrying the long, slow story of Egypt forward, one quiet ripple at a time. Farther downstream, the river widens, and the sense of space becomes even more soothing. The banks pull back a little, giving the water more room to spread, and the current feels like a slow and broad hand moving over the land. In these wider places, the surface holds larger reflections, long stretches of sky, and the clouds appear to drift twice, and once above and once below, softened by ripples that turn sharp edges into gentle shapes. Sometimes a small sail appears, pale against the evening, and a simple triangle catching a light breeze. A felucca moves quietly, almost silently, its wooden hull gliding with minimal disturbance. The sail makes no loud snap, and it simply fills, and the boat responds, drifting forward in calm agreement. The water parts softly at the bow, then closes again behind, and leaving only faint lines that soon dissolve into the river's natural texture. Lanterns sometimes glow on the bank, and their small reflections tremble briefly, and then softly fade back into darkness. In some stretches, the Nile's edge is lined with papyrus and tall grasses, and the plants lean close to the water, as if listening. And when the wind passes through them, it makes a soft brushing sound, like fingers moving over fabric. The river seems to answer with a faint lap at the shore, a repeating and unhurried touch that feels comforting in its predictability. Beyond the cultivated land, where the green fades, the desert returns with its wide quiet, and the contrast becomes a gentle reminder of why the river matters. The sand, pale and dry, is beautiful in its own stillness, but it does not offer coolness, and it does not offer growth. The river, without making any claim, offers both, and it has offered them for longer than any one person can fully imagine. And as you follow the Nile toward the north, the land becomes more open, and the river eventually begins to split and spread, and creating channels that drift outward like slow branches. This is the beginning of the delta, where water chooses many paths at once, not in confusion, but in generosity and bringing softness and moisture to a wider area. Here, the river's patience becomes even more expansive, as if it is learning to rest while still moving. And still, and whether narrow or wide, whether flowing through tight banks or spreading into many channels, the Nile keeps the same calm character. And it continues to be a presence that does not demand, a movement that does not rush, a steady line that allows life to gather without needing excitement. And if you sit with that image, you may notice how naturally your thoughts begin to slow. The mind likes rhythm, and the river offers it in an endless, gentle form, and the current becomes a quiet metronome. The ripples become soft repetitions. The reflections become drifting scenes that change without asking you to keep up, and so let the river remain in your imagination as a calm companion. Let it pass beside you like a steady breath. Let its surface carry the sky, and let its banks hold green life in quiet gratitude. Let its current teach you how to move softly, how to release, how to continue without strain. And as the night deepens, and the stars brighten, and the air cools further, the Nile keeps flowing, watching history pass by in the only way it knows, and by moving forward gently, by holding the world for a moment on its surface, and then letting it go, again and again, forever patient, forever calm. The river's softness fades as the land begins to rise, and the green ribbon of the Nile slowly narrows behind you, until the air becomes drier, the light becomes sharper, and the earth turns to the color of warm dust and sunlit stone. Ahead, the western horizon takes on a different shape, a line of low hills and quiet cliffs, and beyond them, a valley that does not call out, a valley that does not shine, a valley that holds its secrets the way the desert holds a footprint, gently, patiently, and for a long time. This is the Valley of the Kings. It is not a place of towering monuments catching the sunlight from far away, and it is not a place of open courtyards echoing with footsteps. It is a sheltered fold of earth, tucked behind pale limestone ridges, and a hidden quiet between rock faces that have watched the sun cross the sky for thousands of slow days. Here, the silence feels deeper, and as if the hills have learned to keep sound close, and the wind moves differently, swooping along stone walls in soft currents that feel like calm breaths. In the morning, and the valley wakes without motion. The first light touches the upper edges of the cliffs, turning them briefly golden, while the floor of the valley remains in cool shade, and still holding the night's gentle chill. The rock feels smooth in some places and rough in others, marked by time and weather, and the sand and gravel at the base of the cliffs lies undisturbed, as if it has been resting for centuries and is not eager to be moved. When the sun rises higher, and the shade slowly retreats, and warmth begins to spread across the ground in a gradual, steady way. The air grows warmer, but it is not the open and endless heat of the wide desert. It is contained here, held between the cliffs, softened by the valley's shape, and the light feels almost filtered, and as though the rocks are moderating it. The Valley of the Kings does not feel like a place built to be seen. It feels like a place built to be kept, and a place meant to hold stillness rather than spectacle. The entrances to the tombs are low, quiet openings cut into stone, sometimes hidden by debris and sand, and sometimes marked only by a subtle change in the slope of the ground. There are no grand doors that swing open, no bright signs, no loud invitations. There is only rock and the patient understanding that what lies within was intended to remain undisturbed. Imagine walking slowly along the valley floor, your steps soft on gravel, and your breathing steady in the warm air. The cliffs rise around you like calm walls, pale and sunlit, their surfaces carrying thin lines and natural seams, and like the gentle wrinkles of an ancient face. Above, the sky is a wide, quiet blue, and the sun moves across it without hurry, and casting shadows that shift so slowly they feel almost still. The valley has watched centuries pass in the same way the Sphinx has watched the sunrise, and without changing expression, without needing to comment. It has watched people arrive and leave, watched tools touch stone and then fall silent, and watched sand drift and settle, watched the world outside change its language and its rhythm, while it remained a quiet hollow in the earth. Long ago, and when the valley was chosen as a resting place for kings, the decision did not need to be announced to the cliffs. The cliffs were already here, and they had already learned stillness. They had already learned to endure. The valley simply received the choice, as it receives sunlight and shadow, and it continued to be itself. In your mind, you can imagine the early days of careful work, not as a busy construction site, but as a slow and measured process that moves at the pace of stone. The sound is not sharp. It is the soft scrape of tools against rock, the faint tap of stone being shaped, and the gentle movement of dust drifting down in thin streams. The workers do not shout. They do not rush. They step carefully in the warm light, they pause often, and they drink water slowly, and they return to the same motions again and again, letting the shape of the tomb emerge gradually from the hillside. The tombs are carved inward and not upward. They do not rise into the sky. They descend into the earth, and this descent is part of the valley's quiet nature. As you imagine a passage leading down, and you can feel the air change, becoming cooler, heavier, more still. Sound is swallowed, light fades. The outside world becomes distant, as if it is being gently pushed away, and inside, walls are smoothed, then painted, then filled with symbols and scenes that do not shout their meaning, but offer it quietly, like images seen in a dream, and colors once bright would have glowed softly in torchlight, reds and blues and warmed by flame, and the smell of smoke would have clung lightly to stone. And yet even then, the atmosphere would have been calm. The work would have moved in steady repetitions, brushstroke after brushstroke, line after line, and each gesture slow and careful, as if the walls themselves were listening. Above ground, the valley remains unchanged, and the cliffs hold the heat of the day and release it slowly at night. The wind passes through, sometimes bringing a faint hiss as it moves across loose sand, and sometimes falling completely still, leaving the air thick with quiet. The valley is not a stage. It is a container, a protected space shaped by rock and time. And if you let your imagination linger, you might notice the way the valley's silence feels different at different times of day. In early morning, it is cool and crisp, and the quiet feeling clean and open. At midday, the silence feels heavy, pressed down by the bright sun, as if even sound is too warm to move. In late afternoon, and the quiet becomes softer again, as shadows lengthen and the heat begins to ease. And at night, the valley becomes a bowl of darkness, and with stars visible above the cliff edges, and the tombs resting unseen beneath the ground. For thousands of years, this valley has held the idea of rest, and not the brief rest of sleep that ends in a morning rush, but the deep rest of something placed carefully beyond ordinary time. And the kings who were brought here were meant to become part of a longer silence, a silence that does not hurry and does not forget. And yet, even in its quiet intention, and the valley has been visited again and again. It has watched footsteps come and go, watched lamps and torches flicker, and watched the curiosity of the living reach toward the hidden. Sometimes those visits were gentle, sometimes they were not, but the valley itself remained the same, and receiving everything without changing its shape. If you imagine the valley in a moment of complete stillness, with no one present, and you can feel how the landscape itself seems to breathe slowly. The cliffs stand in calm lines, the valley floor rests in pale dust, and the sun moves across the sky with quiet patience. In such a moment, the entrances to the tombs feel almost invisible, as though the earth is keeping them close, and holding them like secrets tucked beneath a blanket. The Valley of the Kings has watched empires shift beyond its ridges, and it has watched the river continue to flow in the distance. It has watched the desert winds rearrange the sand. It has watched rare rain fall, darkening the rock briefly, and leaving the scent of wet stone in the air for a short time before the dryness returns. Each change arrives softly, and each change passes, and leaving the valley to return to its familiar silence. When you think of a tomb, it is easy to imagine a cold place, an empty place, but here, in the slow tone of rest, and it can feel like a quiet room carved into the earth, a room meant to be calm, a room meant to be undisturbed. The corridors are narrow and still, and the chambers are quiet pockets of darkness. The walls hold their painted scenes like gentle memories, waiting without impatience. Even the air inside seems older, and as if it has been resting for a long time. It is cool, slightly dry, and it does not move much. In deep chambers, and the silence becomes so complete that your own breath feels like the only sound, and even that sound seems softened, wrapped in stone. Above, and the valley continues its slow daily cycle. Morning light arrives. Shadows shift, heat gathers, evening cools, night returns. The valley repeats this cycle endlessly, and with each repetition, it deepens its familiarity with time. Sometimes, long after the tombs were sealed, the valley's surface would have looked almost untouched, and as if nothing lay beneath. Sand would have drifted into shallow depressions. Stones would have fallen from cliff edges and settled quietly, and the entrances would have been hidden by the natural softness of the desert's movement. And the valley would have appeared, to a passing eye, and like nothing more than a quiet place between hills. That is part of its power, the power of quiet concealment. It does not display what it holds. It hides it, and it asks the world to move on without noticing, and for a long time, the world often did. And then, in later times, people returned with questions, with careful hands, and with lantern light, with brushes that swept sand away in slow strokes. They listened to the valley with attention, and they tried to understand what had been held inside stone for so long. The valley watched them too, in the same way it watches the sun, without reaction, and without judgment, simply present. In the warm afternoon light, you might imagine standing near an opening cut into rock, and looking down into a sloping passage that disappears into darkness. The edge is quiet, the stone feels cool where it has not been warmed by the sun, and the darkness beyond is not frightening. It is restful. It is a thick, calm absence of light that invites the mind to slow down. If you step inward in your imagination, and you feel the temperature drop gently, the air becomes stiller. The outside brightness fades behind you, and the passage continues descending gradually, and the walls close and quiet, the floor smooth in places, uneven in others, shaped by hands long gone. Torchlight, in such a place, would flicker softly, and, making the painted figures on the walls seem to move slightly, not in excitement, but in the gentle wavering of flame. The colors would glow warmly, then dim, and then glow again, like breathing light. Shadows would drift slowly along the carvings, giving depth to lines and symbols, and turning the corridor into a quiet procession of images. But even with light, the tomb remains a place of hush. Sound does not travel far. It is absorbed by stone and softened by narrow space, and the deeper you go, the more the world above feels distant, as if it is being replaced by silence. In a chamber, the ceiling might feel lower, and the air cooler, the quiet heavier. Painted stars might cover the roof, a sky made of stone, holding its own night even when the day outside is bright. The idea is gentle, and a reminder that rest is not only found beneath the open sky, but can be found within the earth itself. The Valley of the Kings, in this way, is like a landscape designed for inward drifting. It guides attention downward, away from the glare of day, away from the movement of ordinary life, and toward a deeper stillness. It invites the mind to follow corridors into calm darkness, to let thoughts slow, to let time become less sharp. Outside again, and the cliffs remain sunlit and pale. The valley floor rests. The wind passes occasionally, lifting a faint veil of dust that settles back down, and the silence returns to its steady baseline, like a quiet tone that never fully disappears. If you imagine staying here for a long time, you might notice how the valley's colors change with the light. In the morning, the stone looks cooler, almost beige with hints of gray. At midday, it becomes brighter, and nearly white in places, reflecting sunlight. In the late afternoon, it turns warmer, honeyed as shadows deepen and the sun lowers. And at dusk, the cliffs become soft silhouettes, their edges gentle against a sky that fades into violet. Night brings a special calm. The valley is darker than the open desert, and held between cliffs that block some of the horizon, and the stars appear in a frame strip above. The air becomes cool and still, and the stone releases the day's warmth slowly, like a long exhale. The tomb entrances, now hidden in darkness, feel even quieter, as if the earth is closing its eyes, and in this night quiet, it is easy to imagine the valley as it has been for most of its existence, a place mostly unvisited, mostly untouched, and holding its sealed chambers beneath the ground. The world above continued, and the valley continued too, in its own way, through cycles of heat and coolness, and through passing centuries through the slow movement of sand. This is how it watches history pass by. It watches by remaining. It watches by holding, and it watches by being a quiet container beneath the sun, a hidden pocket of the ancient world that does not need to announce itself. And the kings who were placed here wanted their rest to be protected by the valley's stillness, and the valley, without speaking, agreed. It offered rock walls, and it offered shade. It offered narrow passages that swallow sound. It offered darkness that keeps secrets. It offered time, and time in this place feels especially deep, and not only because the tombs are old, but because the landscape encourages the mind to think slowly. The valley's shape slows the wind, and the enclosed cliffs slow the movement of shadows. Even your steps, imagined here, become quieter, more careful, more respectful. And if you let your breathing match the valley's pace, you can inhale slowly, feeling the dry, warm air, and then exhale slowly, and as if releasing your thoughts into the calm space between cliffs. Each breath becomes long and unhurried, and the valley remains beside you like a quiet companion. and there is no need to remember names here. There is no need to count years. The Valley of the Kings does not measure itself in numbers. It measures itself in silence, and in the steady passage of sunlight across stone, in the slow settling of dust, in the way each night returns like a gentle curtain. As you imagine the valley now, and resting under the stars, you can allow its stillness to settle into you. Let the cliffs stand quietly around your thoughts, and let the tombs remain closed and calm beneath the ground. Let the desert wind soften as it passes through, and let the whole landscape become a slow, steady scene, and unchanging, restful, and patient. Now, imagine the valley once more in the faint before dawn, when the air is cool enough to feel almost sweet, and the stone holds a quiet chill that soon will fade. In this hour, the world feels paused, and the cliffs seem taller, darker, more protective, and as if they are leaning inward slightly, keeping the valley's silence safe. A thin breeze moves along the floor, not fast, not forceful, but careful, and carrying the soft scent of dust and dry mineral, and it slips past the hidden entrances without disturbing them. The sun begins to rise beyond the eastern hills, and far from this sheltered place, and yet its light arrives here all the same, slowly spilling over the cliff tops in a pale wash, and the first rays do not reach the valley floor right away. They touch the upper rock first, warming it gently, waking the color from gray to gold, and then, little by little, and they descend, as if the light itself is taking its time, as if it respects the valley's preference for slowness. When the warmth finally reaches the ground, and it does so like a soft hand, spreading across gravel and sand, turning cool stones comfortably warm. The valley accepts this warmth and holds it without excitement, and it has held warmth like this for ages, and it will hold it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Somewhere beneath your feet, and corridors continue into darkness, and chambers rest in silence, and painted ceilings hold their stone stars. Nothing inside needs to move. Nothing inside needs to change. And the valley offers a steady promise. Whatever is placed in its care will be surrounded by quiet, wrapped in rock, sheltered from the quickness of the outside world. And as you remain here in your imagination, you may feel yourself becoming calmer, and as if your thoughts are gently lowering into the earth the way the tomb passages slope downward, as if each idea is drifting into a quieter room, dimmer and cooler, and where it can rest without effort. The Valley of the Kings continues to watch not with eyes, but with presence, and it allows time to pass as softly as sand settling, and as softly as shadow lengthening, as softly as sleep arriving. Stay a little longer in this quiet bowl of stone, and let the day fade again into evening, and an evening into night, until the framed stars remain, and your breathing is the slowest sound, and even that begins to disappear. The desert opens again, wide and patient, and the river's green softness becomes a distant memory behind you, like a cool dream that fades gently with morning light. Ahead, and the land feels quieter, flatter in places, and the wind seems to move with a slightly different mood, less like a breeze passing through reeds, and more like a slow hand smoothing dust across stone. Somewhere within this broad hush, there was once a city, and not a city that still rises above the sand with proud walls and bright columns, but a city that has learned how to disappear, and a city that became quiet enough to be mistaken for empty earth, and a city whose streets and courtyards have settled back into the ground as calmly as a footprint filling with sand. This is Akhetaten, the lost city, and resting beneath the sun in a long, unbroken silence. If you imagine arriving here in the early morning, you do not see a skyline. You see a plain of pale earth, and a gentle sweep of sand and gravel, and beyond it, cliffs that glow softly when the light touches them. The horizon feels open, and the air is dry and clear, and carrying the faint scent of mineral dust, warm stone, and distance. The first thing you notice is space. Akhetaten was once shaped by open space and long views, and by sunlight that could travel across broad courtyards, and by a sky that felt close enough to touch. And now, in its absence, that same openness remains, and, as though the city left behind its outline in the air, the ground is quiet but not empty. It holds subtle rises and shallow dips where walls once stood, and where foundations once traced rectangles and lines. It holds scattered fragments of stone and brick, softened by time, small pieces that rest where they fell, unhurried and unclaimed. The wind passes across these traces, lifting a thin veil of dust and letting it fall again. Nothing here resists the wind. Nothing here insists on being seen, and everything has accepted the slow work of forgetting, which is not harsh, but gentle, like a blanket settling into place. Akhetaten sits in this calm, and watching history pass in the way a quiet shoreline watches a river, not by holding tight, but by allowing the current to move on. Long ago, when the city was new, and the same sun rose over this land, and the same wind moved across it, and the same cliffs stood in their places. The difference was the presence of human life, and of footsteps and voices, of daily routines carried out in light and shade. Yet even then, the city's mood would have been quieter than other places, and because it was built to face the sky, and the sky encourages calm. Imagine a city at dawn, when the air is cool and the light is pale. The ground holds the night's chill, and the first sunlight touches the cliffs, turning them into soft gold, and then slides slowly down toward the plain, as if the day is arriving carefully, and not wanting to disturb anyone still asleep. In the city's courtyards, the light would have spread across open spaces, warming mud brick walls and smooth floors, and doors would have opened slowly. People would have stepped out softly, their movements unhurried, their voices low in the early hour. Water would have been carried, and bread would have been prepared. The day would have begun in quiet repetitions. There is a particular calm to a city built in sunlight. Shadows become gentle tools, and stretching and shrinking with the day, marking time without clocks. In Akhetaten, the sun would have been a steady companion, moving across rooftops, across temples, and across streets, laying warmth down and then lifting it away. The city's name means a horizon, a place where the sun is held, and even if you do not hold names closely, and you can feel the meaning in the landscape. The cliffs curve in a way that frames the sky, and the plain opens toward light, and as if the earth itself is offering a wide space for sunrise. Now, all that remains is the quiet frame. The city is gone, and yet the sunlight still arrives, and the wind still passes. The cliffs still catch gold at dawn and release it at dusk. And the ground still holds the memory of straight lines, of walls that once made shade, and of pathways that once guided footsteps. If you walk slowly across this imagined ground, your steps would be gentle, and the earth beneath would feel firm in places and soft in others. You might feel small fragments shift underfoot, little pieces of brick, tiny stones, grains of sand that slide away and then settle again, and you might pause and look down, noticing how the surface holds hints of human life, a shard of pottery, worn smooth, a piece of stone shaped by a hand long ago, and a small depression that could have been a doorway. Each hint is quiet. None of it calls out. It simply rests. This is the kind of history that sleeps, and Akhetaten was once filled with light, and now it is filled with stillness, and there is a gentle beauty in that transformation, and the city has become part of the desert's slow rhythm, joining the cycle of wind and sun, of dust rising and settling, of heat building and easing. And in the bright mid-morning, the plain becomes warm. The air shimmers faintly in the distance. The color of the land turns pale, almost creamy, and the cliffs stand like calm guardians, watching without movement. The silence is deep, but not uncomfortable. It feels spacious, giving the mind room to drift. And if you imagine the city as it once was, you do not need to imagine crowds or noise. Instead, picture soft movement, measured routines, and quiet voices carried gently by the open air. Picture sandals stepping on packed earth. Picture cloth shifting in a breeze. Picture water poured into a bowl, and the sound small and round, disappearing quickly into the larger hush. A city can be busy without being loud. Akhetaten in your mind, and is a place where activity unfolds like a slow river, steady and continuous, without sudden edges. And there were homes with courtyards where sunlight could fall into the center, warming the space. There were rooms where shade offered relief, where air felt cooler, and where walls held the day's warmth and released it slowly. There were gardens where green could survive with careful tending, where leaves could stir softly in the wind, and bringing a faint scent of growth into the dry air. And there were temples, open to the sky, where light was not blocked, where the sun could touch stone directly. And these spaces would have felt airy and bright, with long sight lines and a sense of openness that encourages a slower breath. Then, over time, the city changed. Not suddenly, and not with a single dramatic moment, but gradually, like a cloth fading in sunlight. People left. Routines ended. Doors closed and were not opened again, and dust began to settle in corners. Wind began to enter rooms that no longer had voices. And the desert, patient as always, began its quiet work. Mud brick walls, and strong for their time, softened under weather. Roofs fell in gently, not with a crash, but with a slow surrender. Sand drifted into empty spaces, and filling them like water filling a hollow. Stones shifted, lines blurred. The city became flatter, lower, quieter. The sun continued to rise. The sun continued to set, and the cliffs continued to hold their calm shapes. And Akhetaten, the horizon city, slipped into silence, becoming a place where history rests rather than speaks. And if you sit with that image, you may feel how time behaves differently here. In a living city, time feels urgent. In a sleeping city, time feels wide. Days stretch longer, and minutes soften. The mind becomes less sharp, more fluid, like the edge in a dune. You can imagine the midday heat now, heavy but steady, lying over the plain. And the air is bright. The ground is warm. The wind slows, then stirs again, then slows once more. The silence remains. In such heat, even your thoughts may slow, and as if the warmth is pressing them gently downward, encouraging rest. The idea of a lost city becomes less like a puzzle and more like a lullaby, and a reminder that even the most carefully shaped places can return to the earth without struggle. Akhetaten watches history pass by through layers of sand, and through changing skies, through distant footsteps that come and go. Travelers arrive, curious, and then leave. Scholars measure stones, and then pack their tools away, and the valley remains. The plain remains. The city remains in its quiet way as a pattern pressed into the land. At sunset, the light becomes softer, and the landscape turns warmer. The cliffs take on a honeyed glow. Shadows stretch across the plain, long and gentle, and touching the shallow outlines of foundations as though tracing them. In this light, the city's absence feels almost visible, like a ghost made of shadow. The air cools, and the day's heat releases its hold. The wind becomes more comfortable, moving with a slightly stronger breath. Dust lifts and settles again, and the colors fade slowly from gold to rose to violet. Night arrives without noise. Stars appear one by one, and the plain becomes darker, smoother, quieter, and the cliffs become silhouettes. The ground becomes a soft darkness dotted with faint pale stones. The city disappears even more completely, not because it is gone, but because it rests beneath the night's blanket. In this darkness, you can imagine the ancient people of Akhetaten looking up at the same stars and feeling the same coolness after a hot day, hearing the same gentle movement of air. Their city was new then, their walls stood taller, their courtyards held lamplight, and their rooms held sleeping breath. Now the lamplight is gone, but the stars remain. The breath is gone, but the cool air remains. The city is gone, but the space remains. And in the space holds quiet. If you follow the curve of the cliffs in your imagination, you may come to places where boundary markers were once carved and lines on stone that framed the city's intended world. Even those marks, if they remain, are quiet. They do not shout their purpose. They simply exist, and thin lines against weathered rock, reminders that humans once drew borders and that prefers openness. The cliffs watch everything without changing, and they watched the city's brief life. They watched it fade. They watched sand cover and uncover small parts, and they watched the long centuries when the site was mostly forgotten, when the desert was the only regular visitor, and the wind was the only voice. In that long forgetting, an Akhetaten became pure calm, and perhaps that is why it feels so suitable for sleep. It is a place that teaches release. It shows how even strong intentions can soften, and how even planned streets can blur, how even bright courtyards can become quiet earth, without anger, without struggle, without urgency. And it is simply the way time works here, in a land of sun and sand. Imagine the morning again, the pale light returning. Mist does not linger here as it does above the river, but a faint haze sometimes rests at the horizon, softening the distance. The sun rises and the cliffs brighten and the plain warms. And the lost city remains beneath the light, restful and unbothered. You might imagine walking along what was once a street. It is not a street now, and not in the way modern streets are defined, but the ground still holds the idea of a straight path, a slight corridor between low rises. Your footsteps would be slow, and the silence would make each step feel gentle, as if sound is being absorbed by open space. You might imagine stopping where a doorway once stood. There is no door, and there is no wall. But the ground holds a subtle threshold, a change in texture, a line of stones. You pause, and you feel how the past can be present without being loud, and the past here does not speak. It simply breathes in stillness. In another place, you might imagine an open court where sunlight once fell on a clean floor, and where shadows once made slow patterns. Now the ground is uneven, softened, and yet it still holds the shape of openness. The sky above is the same wide sky, and the sun still knows how to fill a space. Akhetaten was a city of light, and the light still visits. At midday, the plain becomes bright and quiet again, and the cliffs hold heat. The wind moves lightly. A small lizard might cross a stone and pause, absorbing warmth, then move on. A bird might pass overhead, and a shadow gliding quickly and then gone. These small motions do not disturb the overall calm. They only add a soft texture to the stillness. And the city continues to rest, and if you imagine the sound of your own voice here, it feels out of place. The land prefers silence. It invites you to listen instead, to listen not for words, but for the faint sounds of the desert, the whisper of wind, the soft click of small stones shifting, the distant, almost imagined hush of open space, and this listening is soothing. It empties the mind gently, making room for slow thoughts and long pauses. Akhetaten has sat silently for thousands of years, and watching history pass by in the distance, watching the world reshape itself beyond the cliffs. It has watched the river continue its steady flow, and even when it cannot be seen. It has watched the desert move its dunes. It has watched the sun rise in the same east and set in the same west, day after day, and without needing variety. It has watched, and it has rested. And while it watches, it teaches a quiet lesson that nothing needs to be held tightly, and that even a city can let go, that even carefully laid plans can soften into dust, that even the bright intentions of a moment can become gentle silence, and if you let that lesson settle into you, you may find your shoulders loosening, your jaw relaxing, your breath becoming slower and deeper. Inhale softly, and as the sun rises over the cliffs. Exhale slowly as the light spreads across the plain. Inhale again, as the wind moves dust in a faint veil. Exhale again, and as the dust settles, returning everything to calm. The lost city remains. In the late afternoon, the air begins to cool, and the light becomes golden again, and the cliffs glow. The plain warms softly. Shadows lengthen, tracing invisible walls, hinting at rooms and courtyards and passages that once guided daily life. And the shadows move slowly, like hands drawing gentle lines that fade as soon as they are made. This is a kind of quiet storytelling, not in words, but in light. And then the sun lowers. The warmth fades, the colors soften, the sky deepens, the stars return. And Akhetaten becomes a darker hush, and almost indistinguishable from the desert around it. But it is still there resting. If you imagine lying down on the cool ground of evening, looking up at the framed sky, and you might feel the same sense of openness that the city once held. The horizon is wide. The stars are steady. The air is dry and clean. Your thoughts can drift like dust, and rising briefly and then settling again. And in that drifting, you can let the lost city do what it has always done for a long time now. You can let it be quiet beside you, and you can let it hold its silence without asking for your attention. You can let it remind you that the world continues even when you rest, and that resting is part of the world's rhythm. Akhetaten watches history pass by remaining still, by becoming part of the land, and by allowing sunlight and shadow to move across it endlessly. It does not rush to be remembered. It does not fear being forgotten. It simply rests beneath the sky, and held by cliffs, warmed by sun, softened by wind, and covered gently by time. In the quiet hours before midnight, and when the temperature drops a little more, and the air feels clearer, the plain seems to hold sound even less than before. If a pebble were to roll, it would stop quickly, and as if the ground prefers stillness. The wind, when it arrives in slow waves, pausing between breaths, and giving the impression that even the desert is listening to itself. Far away, beyond the cliffs and beyond the imagined outlines of streets, and the wider world continues with its own gentle patterns. But here the sense of distance is soothing, like a dim lamp in another room. And the stars appear sharper in this dry air, and their quiet light feels steady, not bright, just present. You might imagine the faintest movement of dust across the ground, and a thin shimmer that settles almost immediately, leaving everything smooth again. In this hour, the lost city feels most asleep, not hidden, but comfortably tucked into the earth, as if it has found the exact depth where the temperature stays calm and the silence stays deep. Nothing is required from it now, and nothing is asked. And so it rests without effort, while time outside continues to drift forward in long, soft waves. And then the quiet returns, smooth, complete. And stay with that image now, the plain quiet under stars, the cliffs dark and protective, the lost city sleeping in the ground. Let your breathing slow to match the night, and let your thoughts soften to match the sand. Let the silence widen, comfortable and deep, until the idea of a city becomes only a gentle shape, and the shape becomes only a calm feeling, and the calm feeling becomes rest. The river returns, not as a sudden change, but as a soft remembering, and the air becomes a little kinder as you move back toward water, toward green edges, and toward the quiet ribbon that carries light through the desert. The Nile is calm here, broad and steady, and the banks feel lived in, touched by countless mornings, and shaded by palms and cooled by slow, moving breezes that rise gently from the surface. And near the river, where the land feels more settled, and there is a place where stone stands like trees, where columns rise in long rows, and where the sky is framed by carved shapes that have held sunlight for longer than any one voice can keep a story. This is Karnak. Not one building, but a gathering of spaces, courtyards, halls, pylons, and pathways, all arranged like a quiet landscape made from stone. And within it, the most famous hall feels like a forest that does not rustle, a forest that does not sway, a forest of columns that has learned how to stand still and watch. And imagine arriving in the early morning, when the light is pale and the heat has not yet thickened. The air is cool enough to feel clean, and the ground beneath your feet is firm, a mix of worn stone and packed earth. Above, the sky is soft, and the first sunlight touches the highest edges of the temple in a gentle wash, turning the stone warm, then warmer, as if waking it slowly. At first, the temple seems quiet in the way ruins are quiet, but then you notice a deeper stillness, a silence that feels collected, and as though these stones have been listening for a very long time, and have become skilled at holding sound without returning it, and the entrance feels like a threshold into shade. Tall walls rise, and the world beyond the gate becomes calmer, dimmer, cooler. Your steps feel quieter here, and not because you are trying to be quiet, but because the space encourages it. Sound does not bounce sharply. It settles. As you walk inward, and the temple reveals itself in layers like a slow unfolding. One courtyard opens into another. One set of stone shapes leads toward another, and in each passage feels like a gentle corridor of time. Then the forest of stone appears. Columns rise in dense rows, tall and wide, and their surfaces carved with lines and symbols that are softened by age. Their tops spread outward like heavy blossoms, and broad capitals that catch the light and then hold it in shade. The space between them is filled with dimness, and the dimness feels cool and like the inside of a quiet grove on a hot day. In this hall, sunlight enters in narrow beams and broken patches, and slipping between stone forms and landing on the floor in slow shapes. Dust floats through the light, drifting gently, making the beams look solid for a moment, and like quiet ladders made of gold. The columns do not move, and yet they create the feeling of movement, because your eyes travel upward along their carved sides, and then outward across their tops, and then along the rows, as if following the trunks of trees into a shaded distance. Here, the mind naturally slows, and a forest invites stillness. A forest invites listening. And this stone forest invites the same, even more strongly, because it does not change. It does not sway with wind, and it does not shed leaves. It does not grow louder in storms. It simply remains holding its form beneath the sky. Long ago, and when the temple was new and its surfaces were sharper, the stone would have held light differently. Carved lines would have been crisp. Colors, where they existed, would have been brighter. The floor might have felt smoother beneath bare feet and sandals, and the air might have held the faint scent of incense and drifting in slow spirals, mixing with sunlight. Yet even then, this place would have been calm. Large spaces do not need to be loud. They can be spacious in silence, and they can gather people and still feel like rest. And in Karnak, the scale does not feel like excitement. It feels like breath, like a long exhale made into architecture. And imagine the slow rhythm of daily life near the temple, not as crowds and noise, but as measured routines. Doors opening with gentle creaks, footsteps crossing stone, and a low murmur of voices that fades quickly into the height of the hall. The soft flicker of flame in a shaded corner. The quiet work of sweeping dust from the floor, and a repeating motion that becomes its own kind of meditation. Outside, the sun climbs. Inside the hall, shade remains. The columns hold coolness, and the air feels heavier and calmer. If you place your palm against the stone in your imagination, you can feel its texture, slightly rough, slightly cool, and the kind of surface that keeps the memory of night long into the day. The temple has watched so many days begin this way. It has watched dawn arrive with pale light, and it has watched midday press heat onto the outer walls. It has watched evening turn the stone gold, and it has watched night cool everything until the air feels crisp and the stars seem closer. Through all of it, the temple remains, and it watches history pass by in the same way the river watches, by continuing to be present. It has watched the city around it change, and it has watched distant noises approach and then fade. It has watched new steps replace old ones. It has watched languages shift on the tongues of visitors, and it has remained a place of stone shade and slow echoes. When the wind moves through Karnak, it does not whistle sharply, and it slips along walls and between columns in softened currents. It carries the faintest sound of distant palms, and it sometimes lifts a small swirl of dust that settles again quickly, as though even the dust here has learned to rest. If you wander gently through the hall, and your path becomes a quiet weaving between stone trunks. You pass carved surfaces where symbols run in lines like slow handwriting, and you pass patches of light that warm your skin briefly, and then fade as you step back into shade. You pass places where the ceiling is high and the air feels deeper, and like a cool pool. The forest of stone was built by patient hands, over long stretches of time, with the same kind of steady rhythm that shaped the pyramid. Stone placed and stone lifted, stone aligned, not in frenzy but in repetition. You can imagine the process not as noise, but as calm labor under the sun, blocks arriving slowly, and ropes tightening gradually, workers moving in practiced patterns, a pause for water, a pause for shade, then the work continuing, returning to its rhythm. Over time, and columns rose, one after another, like trees planted in orderly rows. Walls rose like cliffs. Doorways formed like openings in a grove, and the temple became a landscape of stone, designed to guide the body into slower movement, designed to guide the mind into quiet attention. Even now, and when parts are worn and open to the sky, the sense of shelter remains. The columns frame the air. The shadows fall in familiar shapes. The stones hold their silence, and in the late morning, sunlight begins to angle differently, and the patches of brightness shift across the floor, and you can watch a bright shape move slowly from one side of a column to another, a patient motion that takes minutes to become noticeable, like the slow turning of a page. And, at midday, the outer courtyards are bright and warm. The stone there heats up, and the air shimmers slightly. But inside the forest hall, the light is filtered and reduced to gentle beams. The temperature feels calmer. The mind feels calmer, if you pause and sit in your imagination, leaning against a column, and you might hear the faintest sounds, a distant bird call outside, softened by walls, the whisper of wind, the quiet friction of your own clothing as you breathe. And the temple does not amplify these sounds. It absorbs them, letting them sink into the stone. This is a place that holds time. Not time as a line of events, but time as a texture. The surface of the columns has been touched by light and dust for ages. The carvings have been warmed and cooled countless times, and the floor has felt footsteps and then long intervals of none. Each cycle has left a soft mark, not a dramatic change, but a gentle smoothing. And sometimes the temple feels like an old tree itself, strong and still, with rings of time hidden in its layers. As afternoon arrives, the light warms, and the stone turns honey-colored in places. Shadows deepen between columns, and the hall feels even more like a grove at dusk, and the air becomes slightly cooler as the day begins to release its heat. Outside, the Nile continues its steady flow. The city continues. But here, and inside the forest of stone, the world feels slower, as if it is made of longer pauses. The temple has watched countless visitors arrive, stand quietly, and then leave. And it has watched people place their hands against the columns, feeling the texture, as if trying to touch the past. It has watched people look upward, and, following the height of stone to the open sky, it has watched people whisper, and then fall silent, because whispering feels unnecessary here, and the silence does not feel empty. It feels full, filled with shade, filled with distance, filled with the sense of something that has endured without needing to speak. And in the evening, when the sun lowers, the temple becomes softer. The light turns golden and then amber. The tops of the columns catch the last brightness, and while their bases rest in shade, the hall becomes a place of gentle contrast, light above, darkness below, and like a forest where the canopy holds sunlight and the ground holds coolness. Then slowly, the light fades. The colors diminish. The stone becomes gray, then darker, and the air cools further. Night arrives and settles into the spaces between columns, filling them as quietly as water fills a basin. Stars appear above the open sections, and framed by stone edges, a thin crescent moon might hang low, sending pale light into the hall. Under moonlight, the columns look softer, less detailed, and more like silhouettes of trees in a sleeping forest. The temple rests, and in that rest, it continues to watch. And it watches history pass by through the slow shifting of sand at its edges, through the gradual wearing of carvings, through the changing patterns of visitors, and through the distant transformation of the city beyond its walls. It watches without reacting, without holding on, without needing to explain. And if you imagine placing your hand on a column at night, the stone would feel cool. It would feel steady. It would feel like something that does not hurry, and that steadiness can spread into you. Let your breath become slower, like the long rows of columns stretching into shade. Let your thoughts become softer, and like dust drifting through a beam of light. Let the idea of the temple become a calm place in your mind, a place you can walk through without effort. Now, and imagine once more the hall in early dawn, when the first light returns. The air is cool, the stone holds night's chill. A faint breeze moves through, and carrying the scent of river water and distant palms. The columns rise quietly, waiting for the day, waiting without impatience. The light touches the highest stone first, and then slides downward, and the temple warms slowly, as it has warmed for thousands of mornings. The forest of stone remains, calm and unmoving, watching the sun, and watching the river, watching the world pass by beyond its walls, while inside the shade remains gentle, and the silence remains deep, and your thoughts can drift and slowly and comfortably toward rest. Beyond the Great Hall, Karnak continues in quiet paths, and you can wander outwards slowly, as if moving from one grove to another. And there are courtyards where the sky opens wide, and the sun falls directly onto stone, warming it until it feels almost luminous. There are tall gateways and broad pylons with sloping sides that stand like calm cliffs made by human hands, framing doorways into deeper quiet. As you pass through these openings, and you notice how the temple is made of transitions. Brightness becomes shade. Shade becomes brightness again. The air changes gently, becoming cooler in narrow passages, and then warmer in open courts. Your footsteps change too, soft on sand in one place, hollow on stone in another, and then soft again, as if the ground is guiding your pace. And somewhere within the complex, an obelisk rises, slender and still, pointing toward the sky like a needle of stone, and it catches the sun along one edge and holds a thin line of light, while the rest remains muted. It does not feel like an exclamation, and it feels like a steady note held for a long time, a vertical reminder that the sky has always been part of this place. Nearby, there may be a sacred lake, and a calm rectangle of water resting within stone boundaries. The surface is often smooth, reflecting the sky with gentle clarity. If a breeze touches it, and tiny ripples move across, breaking the reflection into soft patterns that soon settle again. Water here does not rush. It sits quietly, mirroring the columns, the walls, and the passing clouds. The presence of water within so much stone feels soothing. It is like a cool breath inside a warm room. It brings a faint scent of dampness, and subtle and clean, blending with the mineral smell of sunlit limestone. Even the air near the lake feels different, slightly softer, slightly cooler, and inviting a slower inhale. Karnak has watched the river's moods from not far away. It has watched high water and low water, and it has watched green fields thicken and thin with seasons. It has watched boats glide by, sails catching wind, and it has watched the same sunlight that gleams on the water gleam on stone carvings and column tops. If you imagine the temple in its earlier days, and you can picture quiet processions moving through these spaces not as noisy crowds, but as measured lines of people walking slowly, sandals brushing dust, and cloth moving softly, and voices kept low under the open sky. The sound would have been gentle, more like a murmur than a shout, and it would have faded quickly among the vast stone forms. Torches, when used, would have added a warm flicker to shaded walls. Their light would have moved in slow waves, and making carvings appear to breathe, not in drama, but in the simple rhythm of flame. Incense might have drifted upward, curling and thinning, and leaving a faint sweetness that lingered in corners, and then dissolved into the larger stillness. And then, as hours passed, and the temple would have returned to its familiar quiet, the way a forest returns to hush after a brief passing of footsteps. In the present, even imagined, and you can feel that hush. It lives in the wide spaces between columns, in the cool shadow beneath heavy capitals, and in the way the carved surfaces seem to absorb attention without demanding it. Karnak does not require effort, and it offers the sensation of walking through shade and light like moving through slow waves. It offers the texture of stone that has been warmed by sun and cooled by night, and over and over. It offers the gentle echo of your own steps, softened by distance, fading into the calm. When the wind grows slightly stronger, and it moves dust along the ground in thin sheets, like pale silk being pulled gently, the dust does not rise high. It glides low, hugging the floor, and then it settles again in the corners, collecting in small, soft drifts. The temple accepts this, as it accepts everything as part of the slow language of time. And if you sit in one place long enough, you can watch the day move through light alone. A bright patch shifts. A shadow line creeps across a carved scene, and the color of stone warms, then cools. These changes are steady and predictable, like breathing. They can make the mind feel safe and, as though the world is moving in a calm pattern that does not need your supervision. And perhaps that is the deepest comfort here. The temple will keep standing whether you watch it or not. The light will keep moving. The Nile will keep flowing. The wind will keep smoothing the edges of carvings, and everything continues gently, without hurry. So you can let go. You can let your thoughts become like the shaded aisles between columns, long and quiet. And you can let worries become smaller, like dust motes floating through a sunbeam, and then fading as the beam shifts away. And you can let the mind rest in the simple fact of stone and sky, in the geometry of a place that has held silence for so long that silence feels natural. Now, and imagine the very last light of the day touching the highest points once more, a brief glow along the top of a wall, the edge of an obelisk, and the rounded crown of a column capital. The light lingers for a moment, then slips away. The temperature drops slightly. The air becomes smooth and cool, and night settles fully. The temple becomes a darker forest, trunks and pathways made of shadow. Above, the stars remain steady, and the river not far away, and continues to carry the night's reflection downstream. In that steady night, Karnak remains what it has always been in its quiet heart, a place where time moves slowly, and where stone holds shade, where the world can be watched without urgency, and where your thoughts can drift, softly, comfortably, into sleep. The heat of the day loosens its hold slowly, almost reluctantly, and the city begins to soften. Luxor does not fall asleep suddenly. It drifts, and the light fades in long stages, the air cools by degrees, and the land exhales the warmth it has been holding since morning. Night arrives here the way it always has, and gently. The sky deepens from pale blue to muted violet, and then into a calm velvety dark. The sun slips away beyond the western hills, and the Nile, nearby and steady, and begins to reflect a different kind of light. The sharpness of day disappears, replaced by smooth shadows and softened edges. This is the city that slept, and not because it was empty, and not because nothing happened here, but because Luxor learned how to rest while time moved around it, and it learned how to hold silence even as centuries passed through its streets, its courtyards, its temples, and its quiet spaces between stone. As night settles, and the great structures of Luxor do not vanish, they remain, but their presence changes. Columns become darker shapes against darker air. Walls become calm planes of shadow, and carvings fade into suggestion rather than detail. The city becomes less about form and more about feeling. Imagine standing near the river as dusk turns to night, and the Nile moves quietly, its surface dark and smooth, carrying thin reflections of distant lights and scattered stars. The sound of water is soft and repetitive, and a gentle reassurance that something steady continues even as the world slows. The palms along the bank stand still, their fronds barely moving. Occasionally, a breeze passes through them, producing a low, whispering rustle that fades almost as soon as it appears. The air smells faintly of water and earth, cool and clean, and across the city, stone begins to cool. The warmth held during the day releases slowly, turning heavy heat into something comfortable, something that invites rest, and walls that were bright and warm hours ago now feel calm, neutral, ready to hold night. Luxor at night is not dramatic. It does not glitter. It does not demand attention, and it simply settles into itself, like a long memory folding gently into darkness. The temples, vast and patient, become quieter than they already were, and Karnak rests in its forest of stone, columns standing like dark trees under stars. Luxor Temple, closer to the river, glows faintly where light touches it, but even that glow feels subdued, respectful of the night. The city does not compete with the sky. It allows the stars to remain the brightest presence, and for thousands of years, this pattern has repeated. Day brings light, movement, heat. Night brings calm, stillness, and reflection. Empires changed, names shifted, and voices came and went. But night always returned, and Luxor always slept. Imagine an ancient night, long before electric light, and when darkness was deeper and the stars felt closer. The moon would rise slowly, pale and steady, casting silver light across stone courtyards and along the river's edge, and shadows would stretch longer and darker, pooling between columns and doorways. Torches might glow here and there, small islands of warmth in the vast calm, and their flames flickering softly, their light moving gently across carvings and walls. The sound of footsteps would be rare, and when they occurred, they would echo briefly and then dissolve into silence. Most of the city would rest, homes would quiet, doors would close, voices would lower and then fade, and the air would cool enough to make sleep comfortable, and the body would welcome the stillness after the long brightness of day, and the great temples would stand awake but unmoving, their shapes holding night like stone vessels. They would watch the stars wheel slowly overhead, just as they do now, and just as they have always done. Luxor has watched history pass by mostly at night. It has watched armies camp and then leave. It has watched pilgrims arrive, pause, and then move on. It has watched scholars walk its paths in quiet thought. It has watched ordinary lives unfold, one night at a time, under the same sky. And through it all, the city learned not to react, not to hurry, not to cling. It learned to sleep while the world changed. And if you walk slowly through Luxor in your imagination at night, your steps feel different than they do in daylight. The ground feels cooler, the air feels softer, and sound travels farther, but it also feels less intrusive, because there is so much space for it to fade. A single footstep echoes briefly and then disappears, and a distant voice carries for a moment and then becomes unintelligible, merging with the larger hush. Even your own breathing seems louder at first, and then it too settles, and finding the rhythm of night. Stone under moonlight looks smoother, less detailed. Carvings become suggestions rather than messages. Hieroglyphs fade into texture, and the city becomes less about meaning and more about presence. This is when Luxor feels oldest, not because it looks ruined, but because it feels unchanged, and the night erases differences between centuries. It smooths modern sounds and ancient echoes into the same quiet tone. The river continues its slow movement, and indifferent to clocks and calendars. The stars trace the same path they traced long ago. The earth holds its shape. Luxor sleeps, and in its sleep, it watches. And the night breeze moves gently through open spaces, down corridors, across courtyards. It carries coolness into the stone, balancing the heat of day. And it carries faint scents, water, dust, leaves, and blends them into a calm, neutral fragrance that feels like rest. If you sit near a temple wall, and you can imagine leaning back against stone that has been warmed and cooled thousands of times. The surface feels steady, reliable, and the kind of surface that does not surprise you. This steadiness is soothing. At night, the mind does not need to analyze. It does not need to name or measure, and it can simply notice the way the air feels on skin, the way shadows soften corners, the way the sky seems deeper without the sun. Luxor invites this kind of noticing, and it does not tell stories loudly. It lets them settle into the background, where they can become part of the silence. Imagine a long avenue, once lined with statues, and stretching through darkness. In daylight, it is impressive, defined, clear. At night, it becomes something else entirely, and a quiet path framed by shapes that feel protective rather than imposing. The statues do not stare in the dark. They rest. Their faces soften. Their outlines blur slightly, and they become guardians of sleep rather than symbols of power. The ground beneath them is cool. The air between them is still. The night holds everything evenly, and Luxor has known nights of celebration and nights of grief, nights of arrival and nights of departure. But most nights were simply nights, quiet, unremarkable, restful. And those are the nights that matter most here. Those are the nights that shape the city's rhythm. As centuries passed, and the world beyond Luxor changed its pace, and the nights here remained slow. Even when new sounds appeared, even when distant lights glowed brighter, the deep character of night did not shift. Stone still cooled, and air still softened. Silence still returned. If you imagine lying down somewhere near the riverbank, looking up at the sky, and you can feel how small movements become important. A star appears. Another follows. A cloud passes slowly, barely noticeable unless you stay still long enough, and the water reflects fragments of light, breaking them into soft lines that stretch and fade. The river does not sparkle. It glows faintly, patiently, and your thoughts can do the same. They can stretch, soften, and then dissolve, leaving behind only the feeling of presence. Luxor does not keep you awake, and it does not stimulate. It invites rest by example. The city has been resting for a very long time. Even when it was full of people, it rested. Even when it was busy, and it held stillness at its core. Even when history moved quickly elsewhere, Luxor kept its slower pace. Night reveals this truth more clearly than day. At night, and the differences between eras fade. The mind stops categorizing, stone becomes stone, water becomes water, sky becomes sky, and the city becomes simply a place that exists quietly under stars. You might notice how the temperature continues to drop gently as night deepens. The air becomes cooler and smoother, more comfortable. The day's tension leaves the body naturally without effort. Breathing slows. Inhale softly, feeling the coolness enter. Exhale slowly, and releasing the warmth that remains. The rhythm matches the city. Luxor breathes slowly at night. Far away, beyond the temples and the river, the desert rests too, and dunes cool. Wind slows. Sand settles into the shapes it will hold until morning. Everything pauses together. The city has seen so many mornings follow nights like this, and it has seen light return, warmth build, movement resume. And it knows that none of that needs to be rushed. For now, night is enough, and if you imagine walking through a quiet courtyard, moonlight falling across stone slabs, you might feel as though the space is holding you gently, and walls stand close enough to feel protective, but open enough to feel free. The sky above is wide, calm, steady. Luxor does not hide at night. It simply softens, and its outlines remain. Its presence remains, but its edges blur, making room for rest. This is the city that slept while the world turned. And as you remain here, and in this imagined night, you can let your own thoughts do what the city does. You can let them slow. You can let them fade. You can let them rest without needing to resolve, and the river will continue. The stars will remain. The stone will hold its shape, and Luxor will keep sleeping, watching history pass by quietly, under the same patient sky, and while you drift comfortably and naturally towards sleep. And now, our journey across the sands has gently come to rest. The river has carried us as far as it needs to. The temples have grown quiet. The stones are warm and then cool again beneath the night sky. Ancient Egypt is sleeping, and so are we. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to imagine, and the past has settled back into silence where it belongs. If you are still drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, let this be your permission to let go completely, and let the images fade. Let the words dissolve. Let the quiet deepen. And if this journey brought you comfort, and know that the archives of silent history are always open for you. You may return whenever you need calm, whenever the night feels long, whenever rest feels far away. And for now, there is only stillness, only darkness, only breath, slow and steady. May your sleep be deep. May your dreams be gentle. May the silence hold you safely. And good night and sleep well.